Roger, go for deploy.
Welcome back to Adventure Fit Radio, everybody. I think I was a bit flat there. This week on the show, guys, I hope you're doing well. This week on the show, we interviewed a man. Well, I interviewed a man, actually. His name is David Matheson. He is a star myth investigator, guys. And if you guys are into mythology, if you're into non-Western based science and history, so I'm talking about the Graham Hancocks of the world, the Randall Carlsons, the Dr. Carmen Bulters, all those people that think there is more to history than meets the eye than we were initially taught in school, then this episode is for you guys. We spoke about everything from religion to spirituality to consciousness to what some of the myths like Noah's Ark and even things like Jesus and Krishna and Vishnu and all that stuff really mean and what the stars could hold for us all. So it's fascinating stuff, guys. Even if you're not into it, it's pretty groundbreaking, guys. Today's episode is brought to you by Quash Creative. Quash Creative is an Elwood-based freelance design firm run by our mate Sean Marsh. His sole aim is to solve business challenges with creative solutions, whether that solution is a new website, logo, or marketing strategy. If you come to him with a problem, he'll work out the most effective way to solve it. Offer is, if you mention Adventure Fit Radio, when you hook up with Shawnee, he will give you a free basic SEO report on your website or feedback on your existing brand. Guys, we are also brought to you by Audible. So Audible is an online world, basically, of audiobooks. It's where I get all of my books from. I still try to read a book a month, a book every 2 weeks, a book a month. But when I'm on the go, guys, is when I listen to all my Audible books. And I've just started The Way of the Peaceful Warrior by Dan Millman. I can't recommend that book highly enough. Guys, if you are into reading but don't feel like you have the time for it, head to www.audibletrial.com/ADVF and you will get 1 free monthly credit when you subscribe. Finally, we are, as always, sponsored by Adventure Fit Travel. We just had Kokoda. Bilbo just got back from Kokoda. I said it was fantastic. There is Thailand, Koh coming up. Dmitry Klokov will be on that one. So get a bit of Russian vodka into you with old mate Dmitry Klokov. Keep up to date with anything Adventure Fit, guys. Mention, or I guess use the promo code ADVF and you'll get 10% off all of our awesome merch. Without further ado, here's the show. Alrighty, guys, welcome back to another episode of Adventure Fit Radio. I am Skyping with David Matheson, who we will learn a lot. Is that how you say Matheson, mate?
Yeah, that's right, Tom.
Okay, beautiful. Got it right the first time. Go me. So we're going to get into it very shortly, guys, but this is the first time I've ever introduced myself about to serenade, so this is a funny one. But without further ado, here's Tommy's tribute. So Dave, I've covered what sort of music into you, mate?
Well, yeah, I listen to both AC and DC there. From, what do you guys call it? The Akadakas?
Yeah, something? The Akadakas. Beautiful, man, beautiful. Well, that's sort of on the level of what I'm doing. So I've gone with a cover of Glycerine by the band Bush. So we'll see how we go. Alrighty, mate, let's do it. Just a bit of a long intro here. There's a story to tell, so give it a yell. And Dave is here to blow your ear. He can talk about stars and the spirit worlds. I've never spoken to any girls, and I know why. I'm so very pumped, and I can't wait for my knowledge to get trumped. And so let Dave blow your mind. It's gonna be edge of your seat. Rad shit, Matheson. 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 Welcome aboard, mate.
Oh, very nice, Tom. I I love the intro serenade that you guys do. I've listened to a few shows in preparation. So.
Oh, beautiful, man. Beautiful.
Breathless in anticipation. Never been serenaded.
Oh, man, that's classic.
Before.
We had
very unique.
Oh, thanks, mate. Thanks. We did an episode towards the end of last year, which was basically the best and worst of Tommy's tributes, and I only recently listened back to a lot of those, and some of them I was pretty happy with, but some of them were just absolutely appalling. So hopefully that one makes the first list.
Top 10.
Yeah, I had my. I felt on point there. I thought my voice was all right then. So, that's classic.
Excellent guitar. So you've been playing since you were what, 2?
Yeah, I've been playing. Yeah, well, I've been playing. Well, when would I have started? I would have started probably, I think, when I was about 10 or 11 years old. So it's been a fair while. And I mean, I don't do sort of any lessons or anything now. I just kind of practice and do my own thing and just kind of do shitty covers for the podcast benefit. So that's good.
No, it's great. You're setting up vibrations in that's what it's all made out of anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, something to keep the voice humming along to. Do you play an instrument at all, mate? Or?
Actually, I do play a little piano.
Oh, beautiful. Sweet, man.
Yeah.
What sort of music?
I like boogie woogie.
Oh, you can play the boogie woogie.
Yeah, my mom's actually better at boogie woogie than I am on the piano, but I do like to bang on the ivories sometimes.
Yeah, beautiful, man.
I think music's pretty important, and
totally agree.
Singing's pretty important, and actually, we can go all over in the interview wherever you want to go. Too bad. Shout out to Doc. You should go grab him out of bed and drag him over here.
That's right.
But yeah, I think that actually, singing and chanting are part of virtually every culture. And in some cultures, that's like one of the first things you do when you wake up is you chant or you sing, and you do it before you go to bed at night. And it's like we're actually instruments ourselves. So anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well,
I'm actually interested to find out how you learned about me, or what caused you to give me a call and ask me to come on the show. I'm happy you did.
Yeah, for sure, man. Well, basically, before we get stuck into who you are and what we're going to discuss, so Bill and I got into Bill actually introduced me to podcasting, and we started listening to people like Joe Rogan and all this sort of stuff, and we came across an episode with Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock, as I'm sure you're aware of those two people, and it just basically sparked this love of knowledge about the universe and about things we don't know. I think both Bill and myself love being humble in that I guess almost that ignorance that we just don't even know things that we don't know, and the more we can find out, or I guess the more things we can find out that we don't know, just the more inspired we are. So. It sort of came about through that, and then I came across your website when I was watching. So I watched the Pyramid Code, which Dr. Carmen Bulter appears on quite heavily, and then I came across yourself when I was doing some research and just started reading up on some of your blogs, and thought I've got to get this bloke on the show. It's going to be too interesting for him to disregard. So that's why we're here tonight or today where you are.
Yeah, fantastic. That's great. That was a great interview. Also, that both Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson did on Joe Rogan, and actually I met Carmen last October in a event we had out here in Southern California.
Yeah,
part of the South where I am, and that was pretty awesome too. So actually John Anthony West was there. And Robert Schock was there, and we can talk about some of those. Catastrophist things that were discussed in that fantastic conversation between Rogan, Hancock, and Carlson. And it's actually it's pretty interesting how it dovetails a little bit with the work that I'm doing. So we can get into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's kick things off, Dave. So how about you tell us a little bit about yourself and who you are and what you do.
Great. Yeah. So I'm talking to you from California. That's actually my home state where I was born, but I was in the Army for a little while and traveled all over the U.S., but and a little bit to other countries, but not too much. But actually for about the past years or so, I've been researching the connection between the stars and the myths. And I really got into that through a book called Hamlet's Mill, which was published in 1969 and was kind of a seminal book that I probably learned about from Graham Hancock, one of his books, probably Fingerprints of the Gods, which was one of his big ones from the early 90s. But Hamlet's Mill really talks about the connections between the stars and the myths, and kind of does a survey going around the world and mainly talking about ancient connections, but some of these are still present in folklore, but you really find them in the myths and scriptures and sacred stories that are found all around the world. So that really fascinated me because I was already really into the myths. Growing up, I loved the myths. My parents got me books about the Greek myths and the Norse myths, and I also grew up loving the stars and have always loved the stars and the constellations, and we could talk about that. But anyway, so that really resonated with me, this thesis that they're putting forth in Hamlet's Mill, and I really wanted to dive further into that. And it also kind of disturbed me a little bit because I was taking the Bible as if it was literal at that time. Which, and they don't really dwell on the Bible completely. That's not the focus of Hamlet's Mill. It's really more about the ancient myths of ancient Greece, ancient Egypt, a lot from ancient India, the ancient scriptures of ancient India that are in Sanskrit, and they touch upon a few Bible episodes, and I was like, oh, I don't really, I don't really like that. You telling me that they're all based on the stars. So I kind of became obsessed with it and really had to know more. And so I'm still in that's still in process, but it's like learning another language because it's really like there's this code. So it's like I'm becoming more and more fluent in this language. I don't claim to be the expert in this language, but what I'm trying to do is point out the structure of this language so other people can learn it too, so that they don't come to me for the answers. But if you learn these, if you learn this code or this language, then you can go to the myths yourself and talk to them in their original language instead of asking someone else, hey, what's this myth trying to tell me? You don't have to ask me or anybody else. You can learn the language and go to them yourself. So we can talk more about that.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I find the most interesting, because I've been doing a bit of research into your work and obviously with the other guys you mentioned before, what I find so interesting about it is the similarities between gods and religions over the ages. Like, I think I can't remember where I saw it, but it was there was a documentary that spoke about the similarities between Jesus Christ and Krishna and Mithra and all these gods. And I was wondering if you could sort of shed some light on that, and especially because you mentioned before that you were taking the Bible literally. How has your sort of mindset shifted into coming to understand all of this stuff that you do now?
Yeah, good question. So to answer that second part first, I believe that they're all connected, all closely related. And that's not really the way that if you're taking the Bible literally, most people who take the Bible literally, and by that there's I tend to like go off on tangents or get rid. It's kind of like a crazy college professor. I end up talking about something completely that I realize. But so taking the Bible literally can mean there's a large spectrum of taking the Bible literally. But if you believe in general that it's talking about literal people or literal figures in historical terrestrial figures that were on earth, that Moses was an actual person and Jesus and his disciples were actual people, I would say that's on the spectrum of literal, taking it literally.
Sure.
Now, some people will be more literal and some people will be less literal, but usually if you say all of these stories resonate so closely with other myths and stories around the world that can be shown to be based on the stars, that I believe it's very hard to take them as if they're talking about literal terrestrial people that were actually on the planet. In fact, I think they're talking about events that take place in the heavens, and so they're not talking about literal, like let's say King Solomon, right? What
Sure.
was Solomon? What was he known for?
I'm actually not even too sure. This is testing my my old religious. That's a good question, mate. Let me come back in about 5 minutes.
On the spot too.
Yeah, you've done well.
So anyway, he was known for tremendous wisdom. Okay,
Sure.
So he was this king who was endowed with just more wisdom than anybody else, and if you take it literally, well, then he lived a long time ago. He was this specific historical figure. He had this special wisdom that I don't have access to. That was great for him. He had all this wonderful wisdom, but I don't believe it's really about some external person who lived thousands of years ago. I think this story is actually about you, and it's talking about how you have access to. Solomon got his wisdom from the divine, infinite creator, God, bestowed it. He asked for God to put wisdom on his heart, and God did that. That's actually something, it's not just about him, like, oh, that's nice for him. It's actually about you.
Sure.
There are all kinds of stories about judgments. In the Solomon story, in fact, he's told in a vision, he has this dream. He does this sacrifice in a special place, and then he has this dream where he's told, hey, pick anything you want and I'll give it to you. And he says, well, I've been made this king, and I want to have judgment to help the people because it's so hard to judge. And God says, I'm so glad that choice pleases me, that you didn't ask for riches, you didn't ask for power, you didn't ask for death to your enemies. These are all things you could have asked for, but you asked for wisdom to help the people. And so I'm going to give you riches as well. Well, there's other stories of judgments, like King Midas. You remember King Midas from ancient Greece?
Yeah, I do.
But now, he was actually also given a choice by the god Dionysus in most versions of the story.
Right.
And he didn't choose wisdom, though. He's actually known for being the king who chooses wrongly all the time. Midas always makes the wrong choice.
Sure.
So what did remember what Midas asked for?
I don't know.
Oh, come on, Tom.
I know, I'm killing you. I'm absolutely killing you.
I'm just kidding. He asked for, basically, he was already a king and already wealthy, but he wanted gold. And so he wanted to turn everything to gold. So he got the Midas touch. Haven't you heard of everything?
Very good.
Turns to gold.
Yep.
But he soon found out that was a terrible choice because, if he took a drink of water because he was thirsty, it turned to gold in his mouth.
Yes.
Or he tried to take a bite of, of some food and it turned to gold and
it's like those
almost
Skittles
broke
ads.
his teeth. Right. Yeah, exactly. And then he turns his daughter into gold, which, is the most horrifying.
Absolutely.
And so then he had to go to the gods and ask for them to reverse the decision. So there's lots of actually parallels to this myth. You find there's the Trojan War was started when Paris, it's called the Judgment of Paris.
Yep.
He was a prince of Troy, and he had to choose between these three goddesses who was the most beautiful. So there's all these so there's these parallels around the world. Okay. So back to your original question was, how do I take the myths now? I don't believe Solomon and his judgment were just external. That was great for Solomon. He got great wisdom. Oh, Midas, he's so stupid. Nobody could ever be as stupid as Midas. How could anyone wish to turn everything to gold? And then he turns his own daughter into gold. He basically was committing suicide. If he didn't get the gods to change that wish back, and eventually the gods gave him a way to restore everything, and he went and did it. And he said he had to go dunk his head in a river.
Right.
Anyway, he dunks his head in the river, and his daughter gets turned back into a human being, and everything gets restored. So that was great. But if we look at him externally, we would say, well, nobody could be so stupid as Midas, and I could never be as wise as Solomon. But really, I believe these myths are actually about us.
Yes.
And I believe that the story of, all these stories are actually trying to illuminate our situation here in this world, which we're all trying to figure out. Like, what am I doing here? What's it all about? And why am I depressed now? And why am I happy now? And what's this all about? So that's what I think the stories are saying. You actually act like Midas plenty, but you actually have access to what Solomon had.
Yes.
You have access to this infinite realm, And actually, Randall Carlson talks a lot about sacred geometry. I believe sacred geometry is showing a lot of the same things. It's kind of, and he talks, or sacred geometry experts talk a lot about things like the Vesica Piscis, which is this symbol where the two circles come together and there's an overlap between them, and the edge of one circle touches the center of the other circle. And that overlap, I believe, is kind of a picture of the intersection between this invisible realm and the physical realm.
Yes.
And we ourselves are actually an overlap between the physical realm and the spiritual realm. And we all kind of sense that. It's like, you could say, well, I love that girl for her spirit, or, it's great that she's beautiful, but I want to love her for who she is.
There's
or I
like
want to
a
get to know
connection. We have an energy.
She is.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So it's like we all realize, hey, we don't want to just be loved for our physical body. It's like, wait, I want that person to know who I really am. And we have this sense that we're actually more than just a physical body. But we do have a physical body. So we're this intersection, and we're in this realm, this universe that is also physical, but it has a spiritual component or an invisible component. And they're not separate. They're actually overlapping. It's not dualistic. They're connected. Yeah. So go ahead, jump right in. But, that Vesica Piscis symbol of the overlapping circle. So sacred geometry gets into these same sorts of things, but I believe that they're shown in the myths, and that their myths are doing that for our benefit. But if we want to gain access to what they're trying to tell us, it would help if we listen to them in the language that they're actually talking.
Yes.
Which I believe is the language of the stars.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the radical conclusion that I came to, is that they're all based on the stars. They're all closely connected. To get back to your conversation between Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson and Joe Rogan, I believe that this fact that they're all connected, and I can talk about lots of other examples of connections, like you mentioned Krishna, and there's many connections around the world that shows that they're all closely connected. They're all based on the same celestial system, which the ramifications of that are enormous, but it probably means that there's different ways to possible hypotheses that you could use to explain that once you accept the overwhelming evidence that they're all connected and they're all using the same system.
Well, yeah.
I could talk about that evidence, but it probably comes from some ancient civilization that was lost, and then that we don't know about, because it predates ancient Egypt, it predates ancient Mesopotamia, it predates ancient China. It shows up in the earliest texts of Mesopotamia, ancient India, ancient Egypt. So it was probably some civilization before them. And until recently, people like Graham Hancock and John Anthony West and Robert Schoch were talking about some ancient civilization before Egypt. They were ridiculed by the scholars would say, hey, where's your evidence? Where's your pottery shards? Where's your ruins of this ancient civilization? But recently, Göbekli Tepe has been a real game changer, and I'm sure that you're familiar with that. So anyway, that's a long answer to a very good question that you asked.
No, it's fantastic. Göbekli Tepe is a fascinating one. It's that site, that ancient site in Turkey. That's the first known site of agriculture that sort of predates 20,000 BC.
Well,
something on those lines.
Well, not 20,000 BC. So they believe. So you're right. It is in southern Turkey. It's close actually to the border of Syria. And I don't believe it's easy to go there right now.
Yeah, no, it can't be.
Because of geopolitical events, which
Absolutely.
is obviously tragic. So, but Graham Hancock, has written this most recent book, Magicians of the Gods, and he went there. And Robert Schoch has been there, and I got a chance to meet and spend a lot of time with Dr. Schoch at this event that I was talking about in October. And he gave a fantastic presentation about the evidence is that it's probably was completed by 10,000 BC or around 10,000 BC. And there's different ways of dating it. And actually, Graham Hancock goes into that in that Randall Carlson interview and in his book and Joe Rogan interview that you were mentioning. But also, Robert Schoch talks about it in a couple of his most recent books. Forgotten Civilization is one of them, Forgotten Civilization. And another fascinating aspect of it, it's this huge site. It's got circles which have astronomical alignments of very large stone pillars, very finely smooth and sharp edges, and some of them 18 feet tall, so weighing many tons, and very thin, almost like knife edge. They're almost balanced like knives, balanced on their points or something. And some researchers believe that they actually may have vibrated. So that goes back to your serenade, right? They may have been so finely balanced that maybe they swayed in the wind or something. But
amazing.
They appear to have astronomical alignments. They also are very extensive, so that they've only been started to be excavated in the late 90s and early 2000s, and it was known to be a site, but it wasn't really known what all was in there. So that's so ancient, 10,000 BC.
Yeah.
And it was, so the other thing I was going to say, it appears to have been deliberately buried, and it's very large. They've only uncovered about, I think, 4 or 5 of the circles, but there may be, dozens more of these circles, and cover a huge area, cover a vast area of these very tall pillars, which takes a lot of work. So I'm not sure that they've found, as you said, agricultural, but the ability to have the time and skill and specialization to do this kind of stoneworking and alignments. And they were obviously very astronomically aware already that they're setting this thing up and aligning them. 10,000 BC, and it was deliberately buried, which, as Dr. Schock says several times, probably took just as much energy and time to bury this whole site as it did to build it. By 8,000 BC, it was completely buried. And why would they deliberately bury it? And the stones are kind of stacked, they like buried it with stacked stones and sand. But if you think about the typical understanding of dynastic Egypt, for instance, like those pyramids, 2,500 BC, 3,000 BC, if this thing was buried by 8,000 BC, that means it was 5,000 years before ancient Egypt, okay? Yeah. It was buried by 5,000 years before ancient Egypt. Well, how long ago was ancient Egypt from us? Here we are in the year 2017, right? April, we're in April 2017. If the pyramid texts, some of the oldest texts we have, were 2,500 BC, well, that was only 4,500 years ago. So this thing was buried. This thing was buried by 8,000 BC. It was made by 10,000 BC. So it was as ancient to the Egyptians. It had already been buried for 5,000 years when ancient Egypt is coming along. And ancient Egypt's only 5,000 years ago to us, right? So this is as ancient to them as Egypt is to us. And this thing was probably in use for 2,000 years, maybe. You can go into the dating. Robert Schock is a geologist, so I think his dating arguments are very persuasive. So anyway, it may have been in use for 2,000 years. Well, think about how long ago 2,000 years was, right? That was Roman Empire. From us, 2,000 years ago was like the times of the Romans. That's how long it was being used, and then it was buried for 5,000 years before the Egyptians came along, or
it
at
is
least
mind-boggling, isn't it?
Egypt. So that is way earlier than anything that they'd had before, and it shows a pretty sophisticated level of stoneworking and things like that. So anyway, a bit of a long digression, but it shows how I can give you evidence, and we can talk about the evidence that all the world's myths are based on the same system.
Yes.
Well, immediately the academic conventional paradigm, defenders of that paradigm would come in and say, hold on, that cannot be. We know that, if that's true, then there's something that needs major revision in our understanding of ancient history. Our timeline of ancient history doesn't really admit to a connection between all the different myths. And actually, so, you and I we're sitting here. I'm in California, you're in Melbourne, which are lands that were actually colonized and settled by, violence and taken from other people, right? Yes. That were living there before. So the Native Americans, these stories the Native American myths and sacred stories are based on the same system, and the Aboriginal Australian stories have some evidence of the same system going on. And as you probably are aware, the Aboriginal Australian culture is extremely ancient and extremely, it was believed to have been isolated for many thousands of years, or very little contact. But if this system is in place in some of the myths of the Aboriginal cultures, then that shows that there's probably some very ancient common ancestor to all of these stories around the world, and yet they have their variations, but they can be shown to have a similar system at their foundation. Well, that totally upends the conventional narrative of human history and says there's something we don't know about.
Definitely.
Either all these cultures were all going around and talking to each other, and that's probably not the right answer, because I don't think the ancient Egyptians were actually sailing around and saying to the Australians, hey, let's share. There may have been connections.
Let's have throw a shrimp on the barbie.
Exactly. But probably there was something that they were all connected to even earlier than the ancient Egyptians.
Yes.
And then it got separated. Then the peoples kind of got separated, or that, there was some loss, and the burying of Göbekli Tepe. Both Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson and Robert Schoch talk about the evidence of a catastrophe on Earth's surface. There was probably some kind of catastrophe that caused everybody to literally have to go underground to survive.
Yeah.
And it may have wiped out a lot of knowledge, and it may have wiped out a lot of civilization, and it may have wiped out a lot of people, but the survivors kind of eventually struggled back and tried to preserve remnants of what was known. And that's how I think probably all these myths are probably the remnants, or they're probably the evidence of something that was once more well understood, and now we kind of have these fragments that we're trying to piece together.
See, you've opened up a can of words, and there's so much I want to just bring up with you. The first one, before I lose my train of thought, is that I totally agree. I can't for the life of me understand how all these ancient civilizations and communities of people across the ages can all just seemingly look up at the stars and develop their own parables. So we're going with the word parable to just note that, all of these historical figures like Jesus and stuff were actually parables and ways to sort of better live our lives. And that's the way I see sort of religious text. I look at Jesus, if he was a real person or not, as just someone who was talking about ways to, better live our own lives. And Eckhart Tolle, in his book, The Power of Now, talks about that analogy of the kingdom of heaven is actually just a place of internal bliss. You find yourself, if you live with Jesus, in quotation marks, if you live at one with yourself. But I just can't for the life of me understand how all these civilizations would just coincidentally be able to look up the stars and develop these myths that they sort of live by that are just so similar to others. I mean, you hear about, let's say there have been about 3,000 gods across the ages, and there are many gods that have been crucified. There are many gods that have performed miracles and risen for the dead and other things that are just so similar. But I wanted to bring up, you spoke about the major catastrophic event that happened during the Younger Dryas epoch. I think that Randall Carlson and Graham Hancock talk about. But I actually wanted to bring up Noah's Ark with you because I heard, or I think I read somewhere, that maybe that myth came about as one of the survivors, as you mentioned, trying to preserve all of the ancient texts and all of the knowledge that we had. So he went onto a boat and tried to travel the world. I think there's other civilizations that speak about sort of people traveling the world to preserve these things. And you look at sort of Christmas Island and Gedang Padang and other places across the world, and it kind of points in that direction. Do you have anything to shed some light on in terms of Noah's Ark and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, great question. So that was actually, I just want to talk about real quick something you mentioned at the beginning of that. So I do believe that these, the stories of Jesus and Moses and Krishna they're it's not that they're not true. I'm not saying they're not true. I'm saying they're not. Right. I don't believe they're literal, and I do believe they're talking about you have an internal connection to the infinite, like you mentioned, the kingdom of heaven.
Yes.
And I believe that actually the stars, they are an infinite realm, right? When we look up to the stars, we are actually looking out into an infinite realm. Now, we can't see with our naked eye infinitely far, but we are looking out into infinity. So I believe that all these myths use the starry realm as a picture of the infinite realm, but it's not just out there, but as you said, there's the kingdom of heaven that's inside of you, which the scriptures tell you over and over. And actually in many of the letters of the Apostle Paul, whoever he was or she was, right? I don't even think that Paul is necessarily the real name of that writer.
Yeah.
It was Saul, whose name was changed to Paul. Well, both of those are actually those are solar names, right? Wow. Solar is a solar name.
Yeah.
And Paul is actually related to Apollo, Castor, and Pollux. So anyway, we could go down that. I want to get to Noah's Ark in a second, but this idea that there's an external salvation that you have to go chase, or an external, there's an external Jesus who is divine for me on my behalf.
Yep.
Means that it's something that's outside of you, and then it can actually become a thing that divides people, because it's like, well, do you believe it the way I believe it? No, you don't. Okay, then you're wrong, and I'm right, and I have to fix your problem.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
I'm going to come over and fix you.
Yep.
And unfortunately, as I just briefly alluded to, as I said, you and I are sitting on land that's basically been taken from its original inhabitants, and tragically and criminally, right? So that's wrong, but it came about from a culture in general, Western Europe, that was infused with a very literalistic interpretation of Christianity,
sure.
which then got the idea that, okay, we're right and everybody else is wrong, so we can go take what we want from them and change them from what they believe to what we believe. And if you understand that actually all these stories are based on a common ancestry, there's like this precious inheritance to all people, and we all have pieces of it, and it's all connected, and they're all closely related. Then you would not go around and say, okay, we have to drum out your traditional shamanistic belief system and change it to ours. So anyway, we can all agree on that, but I just wanted to mention that I believe that the understanding, taking it literally, can lead to some, I believe, mistaken understandings, and also has historically led to some, unfortunately, tragic consequences. So having said that, I don't know if you wanted to jump in. You sounded like you were about to say something.
No. I'm just totally agreeing with you. Yeah, I mean, it's just, people believe what they want to believe, and that's totally cool. But I think, and this is why I tend to gear towards science as my way to go with logic and reason. I think so much turmoil and hate and violence comes from trying to convince people of beliefs when they are just that. They are just beliefs. And, no one really knows what happens when we die. And no one knows, this and that. We really don't know a whole lot. I think a lot of these aggressive belief systems come from a need, or almost a fear to need to know the answer. And I think it's actually a beautiful thing just to resonate in the fact that we don't really know much, and we're here for a short amount of time, but that's totally cool. But I'm fascinated by your I guess understanding in the fact that they're not literal people, or they're not literal tales, but they're all sort of written in the stars. But yeah, that's all I was going to say anyway.
Yeah, no, well said. And so actually, to segue into your question about Noah's Ark, I am pretty convinced that there was a catastrophe on planet Earth, maybe many major catastrophes.
Yeah.
And I believe that's an important part of the discussion, and an important part of this mystery that we're trying to unlock of human history, this puzzle. It's like we've got these puzzle pieces. In fact, as you said, we don't have the answers. I did want to I don't know if this is the right time to say this quote from Hamlet's Mill, but there's this kind of famous quote from the beginning of Hamlet's Mill that I mentioned earlier, that book that was pretty influential on me. And this quote's been quoted a lot of times, but they say that the dust of centuries, they talk about this ancient system of it was kind of a system of myth, but it related to a system of number, a system of, as I've mentioned, of geometry, sacred geometry, a system of probably ancient monuments, and you guys do a lot of travel. We can talk about that, but
yeah,
they say that, they call it this ancient worldwide ruin. They say the dust of centuries had settled upon the remains of this great worldwide archaic construction when the Greeks came upon the scene. It was already covered with dust, layers of dust, centuries of dust by the time the Greeks showed up. But they said it's tantalizing fragments of a lost whole.
Wow.
They said it's like the mist landscapes of which, like the Chinese paintings where it's mostly mist, but they show here a rock, here a gable, here the tip of a tree, and leave the rest to your imagination. So it's like pieces, they're all connected, but there's gaps that we don't know about. So we're trying to piece it together, and we can do the best that we can. And so I'm trying to, piece together this language that the myths are speaking, which is a celestial language. So to get to the question of Noah's Ark, although I believe that we've had a literal catastrophe, and that's important to find out, well, was that a comet strike, as Graham Hancock and Randall Carlson talk about? Robert Schoch talks about it may have been something to do with solar activity having a very long cycle. There are things called coronal mass ejections and plasma ejections from the sun that could be devastating. And it appears that the sun kind of has cycles of activity that are very long, maybe 12,000 years. So anyway, what that catastrophe was, we can talk about, but the evidence is pretty much, if you go through my blog, you can actually look up. I have talked about, the potential for a literal flood, but I'm not sure that the Noah's Ark stories are meant to be taken literally about a literal person.
Sure.
I actually believe that it may be talking about going through the flood may have to do with the spiritual and physical interplay that I was talking about earlier. Just like I believe the Trojan War, in the Greek, there's two great, very long Greek epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. And they're all about the Trojan War. The Iliad is about the Trojan War with Achilles and Hector there on the plains of Troy. And then the Odyssey is Odysseus trying to get back from the Trojan War. But I believe that Trojan War was actually a metaphor for the interplay between matter and spirit, this interplay between matter and spirit that we're all experiencing here, the material realm, the invisible realm, the physical realm that we're all involved in. And I believe that Noah's Ark and the flood, going through the flood or passing through a flood, actually may be a metaphor for passing through the physical world. You may have heard about the four elements, like earth, air,
wind,
and fire.
Yep.
Yeah. Earth, air, water, and fire. Air is wind, right?
Oh, so yes, true.
the higher, that's all right. The higher elements are air and fire. I was trying to remember them myself. And the lower elements are earth and water.
Yeah.
So as we go through this physical life, we're in a body, we're in a physical, we're encased in this physical body that's sometimes, like in the Bible, called the body of clay, and actually in the Prometheus myth in ancient Greece, the people were made out of clay, and then Prometheus brought them this divine spark from heaven. Yep. He was punished for doing that. But they were made from, what's clay? Earth and water, right? The lower elements. So as we're passing through this life, we're passing through the lower elements, but we have this divine spark, like Prometheus brought them the spark. We've got this spark, that's one of the higher elements, fire, but it's encased in earth and water, or clay. So as we go through the flood, it's not just Noah that went through the flood, you're going through the flood. Yep. Or Moses went across the Red Sea, right? The Red Sea, that Moses and all the children of Israel had to cross out of Egypt through the Red Sea. They crossed through a water barrier. Well, we're going through the Red Sea right now, right? If you think about it, if you cut your finger, a little drop of the Red Sea is going to come out. You're passing through the Red Sea right now because you're in a body that's got blood. And Odysseus in the Odyssey, I don't know how familiar you are with the story of the Odyssey, but it's mostly him against the god Poseidon is trying to stop him from getting home.
Yep.
Poseidon is not happy with Odysseus because Odysseus blinded the Cyclops, who's one of the sons of Poseidon. And not only did Odysseus blind the Cyclops, but then he taunted the Cyclops, which he shouldn't have done that. And then the Cyclops gets very angry and calls to his father Poseidon and says, he makes this prayer to Poseidon to give Odysseus a hard time, that he would never get home, but if he does, he would get home years later, shipwrecked, and all his friends perished. And that's basically what happens with Odysseus. So Odysseus passes through the flood. He passes through the ocean. He's tossed about, and he has all these adventures on the sea, and he gets almost home. He's able to see the campfires of home, and then all of a sudden, down below decks, while he's not watching, the crew, are looking at this bag that of wind that he's been given on the island of Aeolus, or the island of the winds, and they say, hey, there must be some treasure in here that Odysseus isn't telling us about. Let's open it up. And all the winds come out, and he was seeing the cooking fires of his home island. He gets blown all the way back across the sea again and has to go through more adventures. So that's kind of like what we are. We're going through the spin cycle of the ocean. I don't know. I know that Doc has mentioned that he likes to surf. I don't know if you do a lot of surfing. I think everybody in Australia probably surfs better than me.
Yeah,
but I love
we all basically live on surfboards.
So you go through the spin cycle sometimes when you get hit by a wave and you're like, oh, I'm in the washing machine. I hope I get up to the surface pretty soon.
Absolutely.
Well, that's what we're all going through. We're in the spin cycle. We're getting spun by the waves, the metaphorical waves of the lower realm. So that's what I think Noah going through the flood is actually pattern. It's a myth pattern. I call them myth patterns. There are some there's actually a school of folklore study that call these patterns oikotypes.
Okay.
They show up over and over in these different cultures around the world. And actually the myth of the flood is one of the most widespread oikotypes or myth patterns that you'll ever find. It's found in almost every culture that there's this myth and that people survived it in a boat. In the Greek myths, there's a story of someone named Deucalion who has to go through a flood. And he also releases birds, just like Noah does, until, there's a raven, there's a dove. The ancient Babylonian texts, which are found on these clay tablets in their cuneiform, have a flood story. In fact, in the Gilgamesh epic or the Gilgamesh cycle, Gilgamesh goes to the Babylonian Noah, or as he's called. Some of them are in Sumerian, some of them are in Babylonian, or some of them are in Akkadian, which is these ancient Mesopotamian languages.
Sure.
But in one flood myth, the character is called Utnapishtim or Utnapishtim, and that na sound, Utnapishtim.
Yeah.
And also Zithuthra is another.
That's a tough one.
Yeah. Anyway, that na sound, Utnapishtim.
Yeah.
Na is very close to Noah, and actually the name John. If you ever know anybody named John, that name is also related to Ivan or Owen. Like Irish people have the name Owen. That's a Noah. That's a Noah name. That's a name. Or the Oannes, this mythical creature that's talked about in some of the ancient writers talk about this creature called Oannes that comes up out of the sea. This fish creature with either a head of a fish on top of a human. Anyway, Oannes is also a Noah name and it's related to the name Owen or John or Ivan or Juan, right? So anyway, the myth pattern of Noah is found around the world, and I believe it can be definitively shown to relate to the stars. The flood that comes down from heaven relates to the stream of the Milky Way. The Milky Way galaxy actually appears in myth often as a stream. Sometimes it's called the ocean stream. Odysseus travels along the ocean stream. At one point, he has to go to the underworld, and the places he passes, I talk about this in Star Myths of the World, Volume 2.
Sure.
The places he passes are all constellations on the Milky Way. So when Noah releases these birds, there's two huge birds in the Milky Way, the constellations of Aquila and Cygnus, which Cygnus is the swan and Aquila is the eagle. They're right there in the Milky Way. So almost all these flood myths have a bird involved. There's also a ship that's also along the Milky Way that's called Argo Navis, or the Argo. And actually, that's a constellation that you guys can see down there in Australia.
All right.
More easily than we can. It's closer to the...
currently looking out my window, so what am I looking for here, Dave? The big tin can in the sky? Or?
Yeah, that's like trying to tell you how to do something on a computer screen.
That's very true.
See, right?
Yeah, it's a bit tough.
I get frustrated quickly trying to tell you, but So the Southern Cross is actually quite close to Argo Navis.
Okay,
and
right.
There's a constellation called Columba the Dove, right? Columba. Now, the New World, so-called New World, was supposedly discovered by someone named Columbus, right? Columba is the dove, and it's right next to the ship, right? So this figure, Christopher Columbus, who discovered the New World, that's quite a coincidental name. Anyway, there's probably more to that story. Joseph Farrell talks about how there's probably more to that story than meets the eye, but Joseph Farrell is someone you should check out if you haven't checked out his writings. Definitely. Anyway, there's often a dove involved in these stories, or it certainly is in the Noah myth. And that dove is right next to Argo Navis. And as I show in my most, so my books, Star Myths of the World and How to Interpret Them, there's 3 volumes, and the third one is called Star Myths of the Bible, and it shows how actually in the beak of the dove, Columba, the dove, you can see some stars that look like maybe that's what is talking about the sprig of olive tree that it brings back to show Noah that it's now safe to go out of the ark. But anyway, when Noah comes out of the ark, he makes a gift or a sacrifice, and it pleases God. Well, that pattern is also found in the Babylonian text. It talks about after the flood, there was a sweet savor to the gods, and so these patterns show up over and over again, and I believe they can be tied to specific constellations. In fact, the Milky Way, which is sometimes a stream, is sometimes a column of smoke or a column of fire.
Absolutely.
So I think that, after the flood, the sweet savor of the sacrifice that goes up to heaven is probably the Milky Way. And there's actually a constellation. You can't see it too well from the southern hemisphere, but it's a northern constellation called Hercules. It's up pretty close to the North Pole. And that constellation Hercules is usually the most powerful god in any myth pattern. So like the god Zeus relates to that constellation Hercules. And Hercules, the character, Heracles or Hercules, is also a son of Zeus, which means he's probably the same constellation.
Yep.
In the Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharat,
yes,
there's a great, powerful, one of the 5 brothers is the strongest, and he carries a big mace, and his name is Beam, and he's a Hercules figure. So there's figures that have like Thor is a Hercules figure. They usually are carrying a mace or a powerful club, like Hercules carries a club, or a hammer in the case of Thor, which is similar to a mace. And that's because the constellation Hercules has this huge, the outline of Hercules has this weapon. So anyway, the Milky Way goes right up past Hercules. I believe that's the sweet savor of the sacrifice that goes up to the, pleases the gods in a lot of these Noah myths. So anyway, not to get too sidetracked on the Noah myth, but I think it's all connected to the star.
Yeah, so I wanted to I just was hearing all these things, obviously you were just saying, and I'm just trying to sort of understand this in layman's terms, I guess. Is it because we were talking about before how it's close to impossible if we're thinking logically that all these civilizations across the time and space, if you will, on Earth have all these very similar myths, and they're very, very similar. And I guess is the overall contention here that there was an ancient, intelligent human civilization thousands and thousands of years ago that were connected to all the civilizations, or that had almost like a global connection that spoke of all these myths. Otherwise, how would all these same myths sort of pop up in the different areas?
Right. So we've got the evidence of all these myths popping up in different areas, and then we have to somehow explain it. So I think the likely possible explanation is that there was some ancient culture, whether it was a civilization, whether we define it as a civilization, it was definitely spiritually very advanced. Because I believe that these stories are not just a fun puzzle to say, oh, okay, the 12 disciples, okay, which one is which constellation? Because I believe they do relate to different signs of the zodiac, the
Sure,
12.
yes.
Okay, but I believe that there was actually, it's not just for fun that they were doing that. There was actually a spiritual wisdom that they're trying to encode and pass on. And so I believe this ancient culture was extremely spiritually sophisticated. And so all the different sacred traditions that every culture on our planet, virtually every culture, has sacred stories. And I believe that they're almost all, I haven't found any that don't have celestial connections to them. And in fact, a lot of times they talk about celestial connections, like shamanistic type of cultures the shamanic journey will often be explicitly described as being a journey up this ladder up to these different realms of heaven and encountering these heavenly beings. So it's very difficult to explain how this happened, but I believe it's a good hypothesis is that there was an ancient culture. And as I mentioned with Göbekli Tepe before, and people like Graham Hancock and John Anthony West and Robert Schoch have been talking about that even before Göbekli Tepe was unearthed or excavated, but they were laughed at and they were ridiculed. And Robert Schoch talks about how he was in this debate. He was kind of ambushed in this debate where this Egyptologist kept coming after him with, where's the pottery shards? We would have evidence. There's nothing. Now with places like Göbekli Tepe, I mean, there's just more and more evidence coming to light that there was some sort of ancient culture that's kind of been forgotten or left out of the history books, or deliberately left out. Who knows? But some people would say, well, there are counter arguments like, well, everybody can see the stars, so they all came up with their myths based on the stars. Big deal.
I just don't buy that.
Well, it's actually a good, we have to look at it's like a crime scene. We got to look at all the possibilities. But the point that I make is that there's some of these, first of all, the constellations don't necessarily, when you look up at them, you don't necessarily go, oh yeah, that's a beautiful woman, or oh yeah, that's a baby.
Exactly.
And yet that shows up as a beautiful woman over and over and over again. But it would take a little effort for me to even show it to you and say, and that's how you get the beautiful woman. And you go, really? Huh, that's interesting. And there's one where it's a baby, like in the myth of Achilles, how Achilles, he was supposedly dipped in either the river Styx or in a fire to make him invulnerable. And he was held there by his mother by his heel. And that's why we have an Achilles tendon, right? The Achilles heel.
Yes.
That was the one vulnerable spot in the myth, because that's where she was holding him as she dunked him in the river.
Yeah. That's a great story, isn't it?
and it didn't get covered, right? Or it was covered by her hand, so it didn't get made invulnerable. So that's where actually Paris is who shot the arrow into Achilles' heel.
Yes.
According to the legend. But there's lots of myths where a baby is dipped into the fire or snatched out of the fire. There's actually one in ancient Egypt. There's actually one in the Polynesian cultures of the Pacific, the Maui story. There's a failed baptism pattern. Anyway, where the baptism it's like a baptism of fire. It doesn't quite make him invulnerable. Anyway, that is a very obscure, the constellation that I believe represents the baby. It's a pattern that we find around the world. It's actually also in the Solomon myth. There's a myth where Solomon has to choose between these two women bring a dead baby and a live baby, and he has this dilemma. It's the judgment of Solomon. Anyway, right. It's always the same baby. That constellation, it would be very unlikely for all these different cultures to come up with that's a baby.
I totally agree. Yep.
Because it doesn't look like a baby. It's actually the northern crown. It looks like a necklace, and it shows up as a necklace in a lot of myths, but it also shows up as a baby. So these kinds of, and there's other ones too, where there's one where there's a wind, and it shows up as a wind in all these different stories. In fact, it's involved in the crossing of the Red Sea is because of a wind. God sends the wind to part the Red Sea. Yeah. The flood of Noah is actually rolled back by a wind. God sends a wind to end the flood, and that's a specific constellation. And the same wind is found. There's an African myth that I talk about, or an African god. They're called an Orisha of the Yoruba people, who Shango and his wife Oya is a wind. Anyway, this same pattern of a wind is found with the same constellation, I would argue, around the world. And you would say, that's really obscure. And so it's pretty hard to argue that they all came up with that independently. Okay?
Well, like even at the very sort of simplistic way of looking at it, I mean, these civilizations across the ages are in completely different parts of the earth, and none of them can possibly be looking up, unless I'm missing something. They can't be possibly all be looking up at the same constellations, because they're looking up at different parts of space. So how could they come up with stories that are just so succinct with one another?
Well, and actually they also have different constellations in different cultures. So you would say, well, we would expect myths to be based on the stars, but they should all be different because they have different constellations. And yet it appears, based on what I've been researching, it appears that they're all using very much the same system. So I believe there was some system in remote antiquity that was somehow survived, and all these different cultures treasured this system, and they saw it as being very valuable and very important, and they held on to it as there's an author named Peter Kingsley, a great author that people should check out. Peter Kingsley has written a book called In the Dark Places of Wisdom, but he talks about the original instructions. These different cultures, such as the Native Americans, talk about the original instructions that they were given, to their ancestors, and they treasure and revere these ancient, stories because they're their original instructions. But it's like especially when we start taking them literally, it's like we've been cut off from them, which may be, why we're so hungry for contact with cultures that haven't been cut off from them as much, like the places where the Roman Empire didn't conquer, like India. There's still a stream that connects all the way back to the ancient Sanskrit stream. Yeah. There's still a current that's connected with traditions like yoga and some of the practices that have survived in India or in ancient China, these connections of like Taoist meditation where they haven't been cut off completely from this ancient stream. How did we get cut off from it? I believe it had to do with that literalistic. I believe that the stories in the Bible are actually metaphorical, but at some point or another, it was like, no, you can't take them metaphorically. If you do, you're a heretic, and we're going to punish you severely, or you're going
to go to hell,
and so we got cut off from our original instructions.
Yes,
and so we're hungry for that wisdom that's there, and so I think it's I think it's really important that we realize, hey, this ancient wisdom is probably, it's probably the remnants of this ancient culture that ties us all together. Like we're all connected to it. Somehow we can all say, hey, this should unite us, not divide us. Unfortunately, it's been used to divide us, but it actually should be like, wow, I want to learn about, I want to learn more. You've got a piece of this knowledge. Is there like a piece of the puzzle that can help us? Anyway.
Exactly. And I think that, you mentioned before how Robert Schoch was, someone sort of had a go at him. And I guess it's kind of ironic or hypocritical because the overall goal in science is to always look for the evidence. And on that premise, you're always looking to be proven wrong. So you should never sort of say, oh, you can't be right because this is this, especially if you're a scientist,
Yeah, I totally agree. That is, how can you just throw out the possibility of an ancient civilization and say, well, that's, that. And I think that Göbekli Tepe, it's now been over a decade that it's been being excavated and studied.
Yeah.
The history books should have been changed by now, right? But they haven't been.
Exactly.
It should have already, the academic world should have already come out and said, hey, our paradigm was obviously flawed and we're hard at work trying to fix our paradigm now. We had to throw that one out. We got a new one coming.
That
has not yet happened. So anyway, that's why my allegations that these myths around the world are all based on the same system are probably going to be seen as threatening or not super welcome in the halls of many academic defenders of the conventional paradigm are going to say, wait a minute, this guy's over there in that department talking about the myths, but it seems to be threatening to what I'm teaching over here in the history department. So, you better shut that.
Get rid of him. Get rid of him.
Shut that guy up. So I don't really pretend that this is going to be embraced immediately by the academic community. They're going to say, what, myths around the world based on the same system? Nonsense. Can't be. But I've written thousands of pages now with hundreds of diagrams showing this system in action in the myths of the Maya, in the myths of North America, in the myths of the Pacific Islands, in the myths of ancient Japan, in the myths of ancient China. So it's pretty fascinating to me.
So you mentioned before about how this global ancient civilization with all this infinite wisdom was very much spiritually enlightened, and I wanted to move the conversation into the realm of consciousness, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on all that sort of stuff. And Hancock, I just finished reading Magicians of the Gods actually, and he talks a lot about. Bill actually just read Fingerprints, I think, and they were talking a bit about. Well, he was talking a bit about how he believes that consciousness developed through hallucinogenic drugs, and he gives that famous talk about how he, quote unquote, went to hell and back on an experience with DMT. I wanted to get your thoughts on consciousness and sort of how that ties in and to the metaphysical, and without getting sort of too jargony with it, if you can just give us a basic rundown of what your whole scope is with that.
Right. So the whole metaphor of the stars being the realm of the gods, I believe, is trying to tell us that there actually is a spirit realm or an invisible realm.
Yep.
Well, that's the way they describe it in the myths. So once again, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning, I don't claim to be the interpreter of these myths.
Sure.
I'm trying to point people to the myths.
Yeah.
I think if people ask the myths for themselves, they'll find out the answers, because I think the myths have the answers. But I believe in general that they are depicting a vision of the world, or a cosmology, if you will, of what we might call a shamanic worldview, or a worldview where there is a spirit world, where there's an invisible realm that's actually connected to this realm, and it's actually present. It's actually present at all times in this physical realm is only apparently physical. It's actually got a spiritual component. So every animal that you interact with has this, don't mistreat your dog, and don't just chop down trees for the fun of it. There's a spiritual component in everything that we don't see, but that's the invisible component. And the same thing with ourselves. Every human being has an infinite component, an infinite connection, an internal connection to the inner world, and therefore is infinitely valuable. And so you can't just judge people by their external appearance or their external situation. Everybody's got an infinite realm inside of them. So now, how do I get to that from the stars?
Yeah.
Well, you see, the stars, they rise up just like the sun. They rise up from the eastern horizon. They sink down into the western horizon. And they're constantly doing that all through the night. If you lie awake at night and watch the stars, because of the rotation of the earth, they'll rise in the east, they'll set in the west.
Yep.
There's also an annual cycle. And the annual cycle has to do with the interplay between light and dark, right? The winter and summer. And you guys are heading into winter. We're heading into summer. But there's this interplay between the days get longer, the days get shorter, more nighttime dominates in the winter, longer hours of darkness, more daylight dominates in the summer.
Yep.
So
definitely.
That is a perfect metaphor for describing the interplay between matter and spirit, or light and dark. Well, when the stars rise up, let's just talk about the sun. It rises up out of the eastern horizon. We know that the earth is rotating, but it appears that the sun pops up out of the east, and then it goes and sets in the west. Well, it sails through the heavenly realms, and then it sinks down into the lower elements of earth and water, right? If you see it sink, as the sun sinks down into the west, it sinks down into the earth and water, right?
Yeah.
If you're looking out, here in California, as I look out into the west, I see the Pacific Ocean. So the sun sinks down into the Pacific. Well, it's sinking down into the lower realms, and It's traveling, metaphorically speaking, it's traveling through the underworld till it gets back to the east and it pops back up. Now, I don't think that the myths actually teach a flat earth, or that the people who made the myths believed in a flat earth. I think there's plenty of evidence that they knew the earth was round. You could talk about the fact that all these ancient monuments are positioned on great circles of the earth, which means they must have known it was a spherical earth, and they must have had a pretty good idea of its size and shape. But anyway, that metaphor of popping up out of the underworld and sailing into the heavenly realms of the spirit realm, the sun, when it's traveling across the sky, is going through the upper elements of air and fire. That's the realm of spirit. But then it always sinks down into the realm of matter, earth and water. And that is a perfect representation of the worldview of an interaction between spirit and matter. And so here we're actually in the lower realm because we're in a physical body, but we're like a spark that came down from the spirit realm. We're traveling through this lower realm, just like the sun plowing through the underworld, or just like Noah going through the flood, or just like Odysseus getting tossed around in the spin cycle of the realm of Poseidon in the ocean. We ourselves are like visitors from a spirit realm that are plowing through the material realm. And so all the stars do that, as they're a perfect metaphor for this. And so I believe that actually, as we look at the myths, they talk about kind of the first birth and the second birth. That's pretty well understood because of Christianity talks about, hey, you have to be born again. Well, there's actually lots and lots of myths where there's a second birth, or there's two mothers, and you go, wait a minute, how can someone have two mothers in this myth? What are these pyramid texts from ancient Egypt talking about the two mothers? Or a lot of times there are twins. There's Castor and Pollux, or Castor and Polydeuces, the two divine twins of Greek myth. One was divine, or one was immortal, and one was mortal. Well, that's a picture of us, actually. The two twins are not just two different individuals. Like I said, with Saul and Paul, he's actually one person, but he has two. He has his kind of his lower self and his higher self. And I actually believe that the myths are kind of teaching us there's a first birth when you get born into this body.
Yeah.
But then there's kind of an awakening where you start to, and at first you're just kind of totally absorbed in the physical. And we actually can probably all look at our lives and say, yeah, there was a time when all I thought about was physical.
It was like very egotistical, and it was very much,
egotistical, and just it's all about sex. I just want to have sex. That's all I want.
Yeah.
And then there's like,
life, mate.
yeah, right. So then, but there's also like this awakening, like, well, you know what? I think there's actually something more, or actually a spiritual, and so it's not that they're not in opposition. The point is you're supposed to actually get them kind of integrated. Like you have to get connected with your higher self. And that's what the myths are actually talking about a lot of times with the story of like Thomas, doubting Thomas. So that's your name, Tom, right?
Yep, that was me, doubting Thomas.
Yeah, Thomas in the Bible story. I don't know if, I won't put you on the spot,
sure.
But why is he called Doubting Thomas?
Because after he did doubt that Jesus had resurrected. Is that what it was?
Right. That's right. Yes. And so there's this confrontation scene, and Jesus says, hey, I hear that you're doubting.
Yeah.
Stop, come over here and put your hand right here in the
hole. That's right.
In the hole, right? And this actually, I've written a lot about this, and it appears in a lot of my books, and it's also on my blog. And if you go to my website, there's some discussion of the Thomas. This scene actually relates to the constellation Capricorn, which there's actually a St. Thomas's Day, which we could get into all that. But
sure.
The constellation Capricorn is actually pointing towards the wound in the side. The constellations themselves, I believe it shows that this is a celestial metaphor, but it's also
really. So it's pointing to a constellation symbol for Jesus, and the hole from the stab wound in his ribs.
Yeah, it's pointing to Aquarius. No, so Capricorn is right next to Aquarius.
Wow.
Aquarius is a sign in the zodiac that's actually between the sheep and the goats, right? So he says, I'm going to separate the sheep from the goats. Capricorn is a goat. Aquarius is actually right next to Pisces, but right after Pisces is Aries. That's the ram. So the ram is the sheep. Capricorn is the goats. The constellation Aquarius, the outline of Aquarius, has a wound in its side, or it has a forward leg that's very long, distinctive running kind of posture. And that forward leg is also appears in the Iliad, where a lot of characters get speared in the side or killed by a spear wound right to the gut, or sometimes it goes through their back and comes out the front.
Yeah.
And usually the character, nice graphic imagery in the Iliad. Yeah. Usually that character is a headlong runner or a swift runner. So in the Iliad, if you see someone who's a swift runner, a lot of times that's Aquarius, because the outline of Aquarius actually looks like a running figure, but it also has this wound in the side. Anyway, Capricorn's horns are pointing right to the leg of Aquarius. Actually, to see all these outlines the right way, some of your listeners may be going, what is he talking about? When I look on Wikipedia, when I look at the app on my phone, it doesn't look like a running figure at all. You got to use the outlines of someone called H.A. Rey. And you may be familiar with H.A. Rey. He wrote, along with his wife Margaret, he wrote and illustrated the famous stories of, did you find it?
Curious George.
Correct.
Yes.
So he wrote Curious George, but he also wrote these books about how to see the constellations, because the way the constellations are outlined makes a big difference as to how you can actually spot them. Well, I don't know if H.A. Rey knew the ancient system or if he was just a genius and he came up with the ancient system.
Yeah.
Oh, I got to get back to your ayahuasca question. Or he was connected to the invisible realm, and that's how he got the ancient system. So you asked about my worldview. So I got a little sidetracked, but the story of Thomas and Jesus is like our lower self and our higher self. And actually, Thomas, if you're a Bible scholar, if you study the Bible a lot, you'll know that the figure of Thomas in the New Testament is sometimes called Thomas Didymus or Didymus, which actually means the twin. So Thomas is a twin.
There's
twin figures legends and myths all around the world. The Maya have these hero twins. There are twins in almost every myth system. And I believe it has to do with our lower self and our higher self. So your question was, how do I see this, spiritual? We're supposed to be getting in touch with our higher self. And when Thomas stops doubting and puts his trust in Jesus, I believe it's a picture of how we're supposed to be becoming integrated with our higher self.
Yes. Yes.
It's just like Arjun and Krishna in the Bhagavad-Gita. Krishna is the higher self. Arjun is the semi-divine hero, just like we're semi-spiritual. We're semi-divine, but we have to get in touch with Krishna. You've got to the proper relationship between Thomas and Jesus is for Thomas to stop doubting so much. So our lower mind is always doubting. And actually doubting is not a bad thing. We have to have a critical facility. Like I was saying, hey, we have to think of all the possibilities. If it's a crime scene, don't just accept the first offer. Every crime story with Sherlock Holmes is like the first explanation is always wrong.
Yeah. Absolutely.
You gotta look for more clues. Or like Scooby-Doo, the first explanation is always wrong. So the doubting facility of our mind is actually good as long as we don't let it run away with us. But Thomas was letting it run away with him. It's like thinking is good. We don't want to not think, but overthinking is bad. If you're trying to surf a very large, challenging wave, you better not overthink your takeoff or you're going to get eaten by that wave. If you're playing a basketball game or rugby or whatever, when you're trying to take that critical shot at the last second, buzzer beater, overthinking, okay, how far away am I from the basket? How high do I have to arc this ball is going to mess you up. So we have this lower mind that's actually important to have, but we got to get it in touch with our higher self. And that's what meditation is all about. It's definitely like quieting that Thomas mind, the doubting mind, because your doubts can run away with you.
Yep.
Like, you might never ask a girl out if you let your doubts run away with you too much, right? So you gotta find that right balance between thinking and overthinking, or between Thomas and Jesus. The twins have to become, instead of antagonistic to each other, integrated together. Together in the right relationship, and the higher self should be controlling the lower self, and that's what a lot of meditation is trying to get us towards, getting in touch with, quieting the lower self and getting in touch with our higher self. So I think the myths are actually pointing us towards that, or practices like yoga, practices like Tai Chi. And actually, I want to say a shout out before I forget. You're in Melbourne, good friend of mine. Is involved with Elevate Yoga. That's right there in Melbourne. So you can go check out
Elevate Yoga. Yeah,
hopefully
that's amazing.
She doesn't get mind that I'm putting that out over the airwaves to the whole wide world. Everyone should go to Elevate Yoga right there. And so yoga is a practice that can help us get in touch with our higher self. And if you read things like Light on Yoga by BKS Iyengar, hopefully I'm saying his name right, he talks about, look, yoga is, the asanas is part of yoga, but that's just one little part of yoga. Other parts of yoga have to do with ahimsa, not doing violence.
Totally.
Not hoarding things, or not, being jealous of others. And it has to do with getting in touch with your higher self ultimately. And a lot of these myths reflect, he actually quotes the Upanishad, the Katha Upanishad, that talks about the wisdom, this one seeker of wisdom, and he goes to Yama, and Yama says, you have to become like a flame that's not flickering, that's still. Well, anyway, I think these myths are pointing us towards that kind of spiritual knowledge. And so now to just wrap back around to your ayahuasca question, or DMT, or psilocybin, I believe that you can get in touch with the higher realm. I believe that human beings are actually designed to get in touch with the higher realm. So you can get in touch with the higher realm. There's all kinds of techniques. There's books. There's a book called Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy, that talks about all the different methods of going to the shamanic realm that are found around the world. Drumming, spinning around in circles, inhaling the smoke of marijuana or ganja that you throw on, they make like a bonfire.
Yeah.
So you can use substances like ayahuasca, and you will go to another realm.
Yeah,
right?
oh, definitely.
You can, but let's say you're on a desert island that doesn't have ayahuasca. Are you stuck? No. You can use meditation. You can use breathing techniques. You can use all these different techniques and technologies that have been preserved over the centuries or discovered over the centuries, chanting, mantras, obviously different plants or mushrooms. Not that I'm advocating that. You got to be careful with mushrooms. You got to be careful with mushrooms, obviously.
I've done mushrooms a fair few times, and I've had a few experiences on them. So
you're going somewhere. You're really going to another realm.
Oh, you are, totally.
And I believe, so as I said, there are many possibilities for how all these myths got around the world. Maybe one explanation, I'm not the first one to think of this, is, well, if everybody goes to the other realm, maybe some teachers in the other realm say, hey, this is the way to understand the stars, and this is the way to explain the spirit world. You use the stars. So maybe they all went to, maybe it wasn't one culture that somehow all these other myths are descended from this ancient culture. Maybe all these different cultures on their own went to the spirit world and were taught by the same teachers, the same patterns. That's a possible explanation.
Jeez, that's interesting. Yeah. Well, what about if it wasn't just a one-way stream? So if, just because we have the power to sort of connect it to that spiritual realm, does that mean that that spiritual realm has the power to come over to us?
Great question. So I believe that if we had, and I say the shamanic worldview, that's, that term can be overused, but I'm using it as a general term to mean the worldview that there is an invisible realm of some sort. It can be called the other world, the dream time, the spirit world, the realm of the gods, even the realm of pure potentiality in quantum physics. Some of the writings of these theoretical physicists of the past 100 years have been talking about, well, there seems to be this realm of pure potentiality. So I believe there's a spirit realm being talked about and that we have access to it. And so there are some things that can only be learned by going there, according to the shamanic worldview, basically, in general, speaking in a general way, says that there's certain things you can only learn by going there, and there's also certain things you can only fix by going there.
Yes.
Like a shaman might have to heal a disease of somebody or fix a problem, like, hey, where are all the antelope? Well, they've all disappeared, and we can't hunt them because somehow we've pissed off the antelope. So we got to go to the spirit realm to fix that problem and repair whatever insult that we've done to them. So there are certain things can only be fixed by going there. Well, that implies that there's a two-way street, right? Because if you can heal a disease or fix a problem only by going to the spirit realm, then that implies that changes that happen in the spirit realm can affect what happens here, and maybe things that happen here can have an impact in the spirit realm. And a lot of times in Greek myth, in fact, in the Iliad, the gods are upset, and the ships can't sail because the gods are changing the weather.
Yes.
Because some god or goddess has been offended, and now we have to go find the prophet to tell us, hey, what's going on in the spirit realm? Oh, well, you see, you insulted the goddess Artemis, and here's what you have to do to fix that. So yes, I believe it's a two-way street, and I think that actually even quantum physics talks about the realm of pure potentiality. So that's like the realm where everything is possible. It hasn't manifested yet.
Well, that's
and in
right.
fact, there's I'll let you go. I was just throwing Laird Scranton has talked about. He has talked about the Dogon people of northern part of Africa, and how they interact with the spirit realm. And he said they have some interesting metaphors to explain how this works. And I talk about one of them in a blog post. But it's like the infinite realm is pure potential, and this realm is manifestation. So we can do things here that the pure potential realm can only observe, but, well, I'm not saying that exactly right, but it's like
Sure.
if a tree is still in its acorn, how many branches does it have? Well, we don't know how many branches
It's
it's going to
infinite.
have.
Yeah, it could be anything.
Infinite potential.
Yes.
But then when it grows into a tree, then it does manifest a specific number of branches. You could sit there and count all the branches and say, yep, that oak tree has 4,000 branches.
Sure.
And one. So now it's come out of the realm of pure potential and into the realm of physicality. So there's this interesting interplay between, like, the gods can show us signs, but we have to do some things. It's like we have to take some action.
Yes.
They can help us, but we have to do. There's a synergy. So it's not dualistic. It's like the material realm and the spiritual realm are not two different realms. They are on top of each other. They're interpenetrated. They're intertwined in this way that's really amazing. And, if you go to the myths, they'll help us understand how they're intertwined and how to interplay between them.
Well, see, yeah, I mean, God, it is fascinating stuff. We probably should. I mean, it seems like you and I could probably talk about this for hours. And I think the next time we're in California, we're going to have to owe it to each other to catch up with a couple of beers and have a chat, because it's fascinating stuff. But I wanted to ask just quickly, mate, what's next for David Matheson? What are you currently working on, or some ventures you're in clear sight of walking down?
Yeah, thanks, Tom. So it would be great to link up sometime. It'd
Absolutely.
be fantastic. Come on over to California and we'll look at some stars together. I'll pull out the laser pointer and show constellations, and we can talk about the myths that connect to them.
That sounds epic. Love it.
That'd be fun. And if you're doing a trip to Southern California or something, I can drive down there. But
beautiful.
But right now, I'm actually just getting a book out the door that talks about a lot of these patterns that we talked about and kind of how it applies to the human spirit, or how it applies to our daily lives. It's called Astro Theology for Life. Sometimes this study is sometimes called Astro Theology. I don't necessarily love that term, but anyway, that's a brand new book that I'm working on getting out the door. And
awesome,
and I'm looking forward to, just continuing this research and looking at other myths. So in this particular book, I'm trying to look more at patterns, but I've also tried to just like delve down, doing a whole book on the Greek myths, a whole book on the stories in the Bible. I'd like to do some other cultures. I'd love to go back and do like a really deep dive into the myths of India or Mesopotamia, or I still haven't done the Norse myths, the Celtic myths. There's basically, there's so much material you could never run out. And in fact, you can't even do justice to any myth system in one book or 100 books, because it's infinite. So I'm just trying to continue to learn this language, and it's a journey.
Love it. Beautiful, mate. Well, let's move into 3 from 3. So 3 questions. We normally say 3 questions from me, and actually no, Bill always leads this one off, and he goes 3 questions from me, 3 questions from Tommy. But today I will go 3 questions from Tommy, which is me. So Dave, what do you like to do in your spare time, my friend?
Yeah, so that's good. I do like to surf. I think
Beautiful.
I think that interacting with waves in any form may be good for you, right? So you're playing guitar, you're interacting with waves. If you're singing, you're making waves.
Very true.
And if you're surfing, you're interacting with waves. So I do like to do that. I like to, study the myths. I like to go out and look at the stars. In fact, I think if you want a free hobby that can be infinitely rewarding, you can go out and look at the stars every night.
Yep.
If you walk the dog every night, and walk the same route, and if you walk a circle, a large circle through your neighborhood where you can see off to the north, to the south, if on your route you can get views of all the different directions, then you can the stars can start to become kind of familiar to. I've used the metaphor of a pub or a bar, right? If you go to a bar for the first time in a strange town, you won't know anybody.
Yeah, for sure.
If you go there every night, pretty soon you'll actually start to become familiar with people, and then pretty soon they'll start to become your friends.
Yep.
But you kind of have to go every night, or you have to go regularly. If you just go out and see the stars every night, they'll start to become familiar to you, and then they'll start to become your familiar friends. And
Definitely.
They change throughout the year. So I love to do that. So those are some things.
Cool.
And I'm raising a family, so that takes
Oh,
up
beautiful. Just, you never get time to sleep, mate. That's fantastic.
Exactly.
Now, what about someone you look up to or a big inspiration you had growing up as a kid?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Probably, well, of course, I looked up to my dad.
Yes.
But I looked up to a lot of military figures, so I ended up in the military. Maybe that was the wrong maybe it was the wrong path, or maybe it was the right path.
So how long were you in the military for?
I was in the military, active duty in the Army for 11 years.
Wow.
So I went to the military academy. But actually there was a book called Crazy Horse and Custer, which was about, again, the tragic wars between, the U.S. Army and the Native Americans. But Crazy Horse was actually Native American genius, military genius, but he was also, his name came from his vision. He went on a spirit quest and saw a horse in the spirit world.
Wow.
And, in the Native American culture, everybody could go on a spirit quest. There were shamans who were especially adept at going to the spirit world, but it was also something that everybody was capable of interacting with.
Yes.
And so Crazy Horse and Custer was this book by a pretty famous historian, but it was one of his early books. And it kind of talks about the contrast between those two figures. Custer was in many ways a very flawed, very violent guy, but Crazy Horse was about the same age, and so he kind of talks about the upbringing, what culture they both grew up in. Anyway, so Crazy Horse was actually one of my heroes growing up. And Odysseus, actually, the Odyssey was like this book that I loved even as a child. And I actually, so as I mentioned, I was in the military. I went to the military academy. I got to finish off teaching at the military academy as an instructor in the Department of English and Philosophy, and got to teach the Odyssey. So that was fantastic. So Odysseus, the Odyssey is one of my favorite, most influential books on my life. And Odysseus is really one of my heroes growing up, even like from when I was 10 years old or something.
Dude, that's amazing. Yeah. Hey, final question, my friend. If you can invite now, have you prepared for this one?
Yeah, I saw your little notes.
Good.
Go ahead and swing it on me. This is a hard one.
This is a tough one. So I think look, what I'm probably going to start doing with guests in the future is give them some time to prepare for this one, because more often than not, we've had people just sort of stumped. So it's interesting. Now, David, if you could invite 3 people, dead or alive, to dinner, who would they be and why?
Yeah, so probably I'd choose alive, right?
Yeah. I probably think so. It makes sense. Unless you wouldn't want dead bodies around a dinner table. Look, I'm not judging, mate. It's 2017.
So I would say, this is a tough one, obviously, because there's infinite.
Yes.
We want to have infinite dinner parties. But,
absolutely.
I would say that one of the designers of Göbekli Tepe would be great to have.
That's cool.
Because then maybe they could tell us about who this ancient culture was, what they were doing. That would be great. If I could have one of the designers of Göbekli Tepe, somebody who knew what it was all about, and I could also have a translator, or I could speak their language, that'd be great. So that covers the extremely ancient.
That's a good one.
Hopefully I'll say her name right. Hypatia was the last librarian of the Library of Alexandria. Right. Wow. So there's this famous Library of Alexandria that was burned down, and apparently Hypatia was murdered, according to the stories, by kind of a rampaging mob. Some blame it on the literalist Christians. Maybe did this. I don't know. Yeah. But the tradition is that the Library of Alexandria they were trying to collect all the texts of the ancient wisdom of the ancient world. So Hypatia would presumably, as she was supposedly extremely accomplished in all these different subjects of mathematics and geometry and history and having access to all those texts. She grew up in this library. I think her father was the librarian before her, and so she was extremely knowledgeable. If she could come to the dinner party, that would be fantastic. So maybe she could tell us some of those things about the ancient world that were destroyed in that Library of Alexandria, and some of the mysteries about the ancient, it was in Alexandria, is in northern Egypt. That would have been
that would be
fantastic.
100%.
Her to cover kind of the ancient world after the, Göbekli Tepe was so ancient. So we have to get one from there to cover that. And then Hypatia, tell us about that. And then I would say Martin Luther King.
Maybe a good one.
To help us out with the situations that we're in today.
Definitely.
So he was living in a very turmoil time, and obviously he was criminally, tragically assassinated, murdered. I have a feeling he knew a lot about what was really going on in the 60s, which was this incredibly important time when there was a struggle going on, and didn't necessarily turn out the right way, right? Many of those great leaders from that time were silenced by assassination, including Martin Luther King. So, but he was being very effective at creating change and doing it in a nonviolent way. And I think he would have a lot to tell us for our situation today. So those are my three dinner party guests, Tom.
Beautiful. I love them. I think I'll have to get down to that dinner party. What are we eating?
Vegetarian.
Yeah, sounds good. Fair enough.
All vegetarian and non-GMO and organic.
Yeah, exactly. Well played. Hey, David, finally, where can people find you? Anything you want to plug? Your social medias, all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, well, just first of all, thanks so much for having me on, and thanks for giving me a platform.
Sure, awesome, man. Loved
it. Really enjoyed this conversation. You did great preparing and asked great questions.
Beautiful.
So
thanks, man.
If people want to, so thank you. And if people want to learn more or read more, I have a website called starmythworld.com.
Beautiful.
You could actually just, if you just search for my name, Matheson, and stars, you'll probably stumble across something that could take you towards my website, starmythworld.com. And on that Star Myth World website, there's a bunch of myths. So there's a section called The Myths, and I've got maybe 20 or so myths there that I talk about the connections between the stars and these different myths.
Yeah.
Or gods and goddesses, like Ganesh, I think is on there. There's also a section called Books where you can read some of the sample content from my books by clicking on the pictures of any of the titles there. Obviously, people can read the books by going to their local bookstore and asking them to get it. It's distributed by Ingram, which I think is pretty big worldwide, so probably can get it to you in Australia if you ask your local bookstore. Or you can even go to a library and say, hey, could you please order this book? And then they could have it on the shelves for everybody. But so they can check out the books section. There's also a blog section on that same website, starmythworld.com. So I've got a blog that's been going for a long time. It's searchable, so you can search for topics like divine twins or higher self or Achilles or Iliad or whatever. So that blog is also... It's on that website, starmythworld.com. It's also, the older version of it is called Matheson Corollary. So that was like on Blogger. So they're both up and running in parallel. So you can find that blog and search on Blogger, or you can find it on my website.
Awesome.
They're both there. So lots of ways to find this stuff, but I just would really try and point people towards the myths themselves. I think we've got this incredible treasure. And so I think you can really don't look to me for answers. You can go to the Bhagavad-Gita for yourself, or go to the ancient Greek myths for yourself and find all the wisdom there. It's right there waiting for you.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the Bhagavad-Gita is because a friend of mine actually just recommended it to me, and I've now started reading it. I've just started reading it, so I'm about a chapter in. But it's amazing that someone was able to translate that ancient language of Sanskrit into English, and the change it had on my friend Jared Fleming. For all our listeners, he's a world champion American weightlifter, as we all know. We've had him on the show a couple of times. But yeah, for you, Dave, the change that was present in Jared, and we just speak all the time about how amazing this book was. And this is someone who now meditates for at least an hour a day, and meditation is a huge part of my life. And it's an amazing text, and I'm saying that and I've only read a page. So, have you read the Bhagavad-Gita or?
Yeah, so that's you got another hour and a half now.
Yeah, we'll have to do a second interview, I think.
No, I'll say real quick though. Actually, it's part of this larger epic called the Mahabharat.
Right.
It's spelled Mahabharata. You may that's how I would kind of like pronounce it if I didn't. And I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it right, but I've been told they say Mahabharat, which is this fantastic story. And there's a retelling of it by someone, I think his name is Krishna Dharma.
Right.
But you can search my website for Bhagavad-Gita or just search the word Gita and see some of the things that I've written about Bhagavad-Gita. Once again, I would caution people, don't read my interpretation. Read the Gita yourself and see what it says to you. Maybe it's best for you to read it first. But if you want to check out the full Mahabharat, it's a massive. It's 7 times longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined, 7.2 times longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. But it's a fantastic story, and the translation, or it's kind of a retelling. It's an abridged version by Krishna Dharma,
awesome.
Which is, I think, linked on my website, is a great one. So you would probably really enjoy the story of Mahabharat. And if you understand it as celestial metaphor, I believe that the message becomes even more life-changing.
Yeah,
I think that's really the way to unlock it. But Bhagavad-Gita, fantastic.
Yeah.
And it really talks about do the right thing without attachment.
Yes.
Without fear of the results. That's really what Martin Luther King was doing, or lots of people were doing. But Martin Luther King knew that the outcome could be that people would want to harm him.
Yep.
But he still did the right thing.
Absolutely.
Or he might have been told, "Hey, why are you trying to change anything? It's impossible that anything will ever change." Well, I'm not going to get attached to the outcome. I'm still going to try and do the right thing.
Totally.
Maybe the outcome will be wonderful. Maybe it won't. But the Gita, Krishna says over and over, Arjun, do the right thing without attachment to the results.
Definitely.
So anyway, I think thanks for sharing that about your friend and about your encounter with the Gita. And I hope that it's a great blessing to you, the Bhagavad-Gita.
Well, absolutely, man. I'll have to email you back once I'm through with it, and I'll let you know how I go. But you're absolutely right. Don't get attached to the outcome. It's all just about putting one foot forward in front of the other. And no matter what the outcome is, if you feel truly at one with yourself that you're doing the right thing, then obviously within reason, then you should definitely pursue that. So it's fantastic. Hey, Dave, thanks so much for coming on the show, man.
Right on, Tom. It was my pleasure, and thanks so much for having me.
Beautiful. And to all the listeners, that is a wrap. Alrighty, guys, really hope you enjoyed that show. If you wanted to get a rerun of anything Dave and I spoke about during it, head to www.adventurefittravel.com. Click the podcast link, and all of the show notes are linked there under the episode. As always, guys, leave us a rating and review. We love to read your reviews. We love to see your 5-star ratings. And it's just, I love the feedback. I love hearing about all the stupid shit that Bill and I say that we forget about. So please jump over there, subscribe, tell all your mates about our show. We are still relatively in our infancy, but we want to make this the biggest show of all time. So help us reach that goal. Guys, head to www.quashcreative.com. Mention Adventure Fit Radio. Shawnee is going to give you a free basic SEO report on your website or feedback on your brand. Head to www.audibletrial.com/ADVF. Get your free monthly credits, so free book when you subscribe to Audible. And as always, guys, head to www.adventurefittravel.com. Keep up to date with everything Adventure Fit and everything I like. And we will hear from you. Actually, no, you won't. You will hear from us next week. Goodbye.
Discovery Roger, go for deploy.